你好，我们是全杰科技，我是高金海，我们现在开始为您做教学展示。
Pictures can also be imported into GeoStudio. Pictures can be imported for illustrative purposes or as a background for defining a problem. For example, you could import a bitmap of your corporate logo and put it on the drawing. It is important to recognize that it needs to be a bitmap file format. A JPEG, for example, is not accommodated by GeoStudio, so it has to be a bitmap file format. I'm going to demonstrate here how this works by importing a scan diagram from a textbook, and the file name is textbookexample.bmp. This is a scanned drawing or diagram from the Lamb & Whitman textbook called Soil Mechanics on page 271. And then once I have imported the scanned bitmap, I'm going to use the picture to create a proper scale and then draw regions. Going to GeoStudio then, and creating a new CHIEN analysis. And once we have created a new CHIEN analysis, then we have a blank page. The first task is to make sure that we set up our page, and in this case we'll use a letter size in landscape format, 11 by 8.5 inches. Also, it is important at this stage to say set units and scale, and the drawing is in metric dimensions, so we are going to use the select metric ahead of time. This is important. We do this before we import the bitmap. Clicking on the zoom page icon, snapping on the grid, we have a 1 meter by 1 meter grid spacing here, and at this stage we can say sketch, pictures, and insert a picture. Clicking on insert, and then clicking on the bitmap file. In this case, the bitmap has been provided for you. The bitmap is called textbook example. Clicking on open, our cursor turns to a plus sign, and we now need to click on the page where we want this bitmap, and we need to click in the lower left hand corner. I'm going to click at the x equals 0, y equals 0 coordinate, and now we have imported our bitmap file. We can now see that we have our default scale is probably needs to be adjusted. It's 1 to 200. We can probably work with a 1 to 150 scale. Clicking on OK, the bitmap still fits onto the page. Let's shift the bitmap a little bit to the left, set units and scale. Instead of a minimum of -5, let's say the minimum is -3. And so now we have simply imported a bitmap onto our drawing and into our GeoStudio file. The next step is that we can zoom in on a particular region of the bitmap, and we see that this drawing wants the center line, the x equals 0, to be at the center of the drawing. And we have some dimensions here which can aid us in setting the appropriate scale. We can turn off the snap to grid, and going back to sketch, pictures, and then clicking on the bitmap, we can now scale this bitmap by clicking on Scale. And there are several points on this bitmap that we know the exact coordinates. The further apart these 2 points are, the better the scaling. They should be diagonally as far apart as possible. But in this particular case here, I'm having a little difficulty knowing the exact dimensions, and so I'm going to choose one point right at the tip of the crest of the weir, and I'm going to choose another point at where the lower right-hand corner of the concrete of the weir. Having clicked the 2 points, I can now type in the exact coordinates of the points. And point A, notice that point A is labeled here, point B is labeled here. Point A, we know that the x-coordinate is half of 25.5. So it is half of that would be 12.75 meters. So we type in here, it's minus to the left of the center line, minus 12.75 meters. And the elevation we can see here is 28.2. So the elevation is 28.2. On point B, the elevation is 18, and the x-coordinate is 12 plus 12.75, 12.75, and the elevation is 18. So from minus 12.75 to plus 12.75 with the 2 known elevations, if we now click on Apply and then say Close, Close Sketch Pictures, clicking on the Zoom Page icon, we see that we have now adjusted the scale such that the dimensions of this bitmap correspond roughly to a scale. If we now click on our cursor coordinate tooltip, we see that this should be minus 12 something, plus 28 something. This should be plus 12 something, 18 something. So now we have a scale, and this bitmap is approximately corresponds with the GeoStudio scale. I'll turn off my tooltip. Going back to Set Units and Scale, we see that our drawing still is at 150 by 150. However, the bitmap has been adjusted to match that scale. And what we now could do is we can turn on our Snap to Grid, and let us say that our Snap to Grid is a half a meter by a half a meter. And we could now define some points. Let's zoom in on this part of the drawing first, and we can say that the elevation here is 19.2. Draw a point, and we click close to where we want a point. We want the x to be 12.75 and the y-coordinate 19.2. We need another point here, which is minus 31.5. Let's make it a minus 32. And the y-coordinate is 19.2. we need a point here, and we know again that x is 12.75 and the y coordinate is actually 18. We need another point here. Once again, we now know that this is 12.75 and the elevation is 18. And we need another point here. It's plus 12.75, 19.2. And we need another point here. Let's make this coordinate 32 and 19.2. And finally, at the base of the problem, 32 and 0, let's say. And at this corner, we want minus 32 and 0. That should be 0. Clicking on Zoom All Objects, we now can use these points to sketch a region. I could modify these lower points here such that it is closer to the actual base of the drawing. Say draw points. If I click on an existing point, I say this is minus 0.5. And I'll do the same at the other corner. Minus 0.5. Once again, clicking on the Zoom Objects icon, we now have points that match very closely to the actual dimensions of the drawing. We can turn off the Snap to Grid, and we could now draw regions. Draw regions. And since I'm not snapping to the grid, I will snap to the predefined points. Now that is the main region. Notice that we now don't see part of the bitmap. I'll show you how to bring it to the front in a little bit. We can go back to Sketch Pictures, and we can say that we want to see the bitmap on top of the GeoStudio objects. And so now we draw the bitmap on top of the GeoStudio objects, and as a result we have lost our points and our regions. However, we need to define two more points. Let's turn on our Snap to Grid and say draw points. We need a point at the tip of the sheet pile here, the cutoff, and it's minus 12.75, and the elevation is 12.9. And the same thing here, we need a point that is plus 12.75 at an elevation of 12.9. Now we can turn off the bitmap temporarily with this icon here, and we can turn off our Snap to Grid, and then we can say draw lines, and we can draw a line where we will create the equivalent of a cutoff. And we can turn the bitmap back on. You can always go back to Sketch Pictures and decide which one you're going to see on top and which one is underneath. And temporarily we can turn off the bitmap. And now we have defined the regions, and we could now define the rest of the problem. But the illustrative point here is that we can use something like a bitmap as a background, and from the bitmap we can create a coordinate system that is very close and matches the bitmap, and that then can be used to create points and regions. I won't take the time here to do this, but I have completed the analysis, defined the boundary conditions and the material properties, and produced some results. So if we go to File, Open, we don't need to save this. It was just illustrating the procedure. And if we go to the completed folder and we look at the file Import Picture, you can see the completed results. I'm sorry, I meant to open a different file, a file that has the completed solution. Say File, Open. Seep from Picture is the file I meant to open that has the solution. Clicking on the Zoom Objects icon, turning off the background grid, and here we are in the results view, and we see the completed solution. It is rather interesting on this diagram as an aside that we can see the change in pressure drop across the first cutoff, and then again we see the pressure drop across the second cutoff. It is also rather interesting, just as an aside, that the person who drafted this drawing did not exactly create this line at the exact elevation of 20.4. If you use the View Results command, you will notice that the total head here is indeed 20.4, but it does not exactly match the bitmap line. View Results Information, clicking on one of these nodes, we see that the total head is 20.4, so that the total head was defined properly. However, interestingly enough, that the bitmap drawing itself, the 20.4 is here, it is not here. Anyhow, these are some of the idiosyncrasies of importing a bitmap. But this does illustrate what you can do with importing a bitmap, and that you can then determine a proper scale for the bitmap and then use the bitmap as a background guide to develop points and regions for your analysis. Now, in this particular case, it begs the question whether it would not have simply been easier to simply visually look at the drawing in the textbook, create a few points, and define the problem that way. And that may be true in this particular case. Sometimes it's not so readily obvious which would be the most efficient way of defining the problem. Anyhow, regardless, the intent was here to illustrate the procedure, and this was a good example to illustrate what can be done in GeoStudio by importing a bitmap and using it as a background to define the problem. This brings us to the end of the import picture session. I will come back to this in another way in a later session.
全杰科技，谢谢您，再见。